Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time once again for another woeful dose of Warner Brothers Discovery. The final DCEU movie that was entitled Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom has come and gone in movie theaters worldwide. It originally premiered on December 22nd, 2023, but ended its theatrical run on March 14th, 2024, so it played for a total of 84 days or 12 weeks. But in spite of the movie starring the very popular actor Jason Momoa as the titular character of Aquaman, as well as the fact that the first Aquaman movie was the highest-grossing movie worldwide of all time for the DCEU franchise, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom failed to achieve similar box office results. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! Given that this is a post-mortem, let's begin by asking the following question. How much money did Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom need to earn in order to break even? To answer that question, we'll begin with the movie's production budget, which was reportedly $205 million. Naturally, we don't know what the marketing budget was, which means that we have to estimate what the movie's break-even point is by multiplying its production budget by a value that's at least more than 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. But since Warner Brothers Discovery waited quite a while to market the movie to keep the marketing costs low, I would guess that they didn't spend more than 25% of the movie's reported production budget on marketing, which would be around $51 million. So when we double that 25% to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, that gives us an estimated break-even point that's equivalent to multiplying the movie's production budget by 2.5. And when we do that, we get an estimated break-even point of around $512.5 million. And did the movie earn that much? Not quite, but it did achieve some interesting things that I'll show. The odds were truly stacked against Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom succeeding, beginning with its predicted opening weekend box office numbers. While the original 2018 Aquaman movie earned $67.9 million during its domestic opening weekend at the box office, Box Office Pro, as of December 15th, was only predicting that Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom would earn around $29 million to $38 million. So not only was that far below what the original Aquaman earned domestically during its opening weekend in 2018, it was less than the $39 million that Wonka had earned during its domestic opening weekend earlier in December. But it was at least more than the $25 million domestic opening weekend box office that Blue Beetle had earned back in August. And Blue Beetle would go on to become the lowest grossing DCEU movie of all time worldwide. Now, unfortunately for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, its actual domestic opening weekend box office revenue failed to be within the range predicted by Box Office Pro by only being $27.7 million. But while that was slightly more than the $25 million domestic opening weekend box office that Blue Beetle had earned in August, it was significantly lower than the $55 million domestic opening weekend box office that The Flash earned in June, and it was also slightly lower than the $30.1 million that Shazam! Fury of the Gods had earned during its domestic opening weekend in March of 2023. So was the $27.7 million that Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom earned during its domestic opening weekend box office statistically unusual as compared with all of the other DCEU movies that preceded it? Not really, because as low as that was, it was still within one standard deviation of the franchise average domestic opening weekend box office of $67.7 million. But because its domestic opening weekend box office of $27.7 million was so low, that vastly limited the movie's total potential earnings, because the vast majority of movies that are released theatrically typically earn more during their opening weekends than during any subsequent weekends. And Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is no exception. But the only way that movies can begin to potentially make up for having a weak opening weekend is to have very low average weekly drops, or by possibly having a very low domestic share. And internationally, the movie earned $80.1 million for its international opening weekend box office, which gave the movie an initial worldwide opening weekend of $107.8 million, which was not that impressive given the movie's estimated break-even point of $512.5 million. But its domestic share did begin at a very low 25.69%. And that's significant because going into the release of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, the DCEU's overall franchise average domestic share was 40.29% and had a standard deviation of 7.55%. So one standard deviation below that was 32.74%, meaning that the initial 25.69% domestic share for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom was more than one standard deviation away from the franchise average, and only two other DCEU movies have domestic shares that are below the one standard deviation line: 2018's Aquaman and 2020's Wonder Woman 1984. Now, before the movie premiered, I did some pre-release projections for the movie's possible final domestic box office and possible final global gross box office numbers. And when I did the pre-release projections, as I showed in a video that I had released on December 21st, 2023, I had based the movie's possible average weekly drop on the DCEU's average weekly drop and one standard deviation above and below. At that time, the DCEU's franchise average weekly drop was 39.67%, and its standard deviation was 9.15%, defining a range around it from 30.52% to 48.83%. And when I used that range along with the midpoint from Box Office Pro's predicted opening weekend box office, which was $33.5 million, I initially projected a final domestic box office for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom that ranged from $68.6 million at the low end, $84.4 million at the mid-range, and $109.7 million at the upper end. But two things happened. The movie's domestic opening weekend box office was lower at $27.7 million, and the movie ended up having an average weekly drop of only 22.24%, which is incredibly low. So much so that not only is it more than one standard deviation away from the franchise average weekly drop, there's only one other DCEU movie that had an even lower average weekly drop: 2018's Aquaman. So thanks to that very low average weekly drop, the movie's final domestic box office ended up being around $124.5 million, which was a lot higher than the final domestic box office for the DCEU's previous three movies: Blue Beetle, The Flash, and Shazam! Fury of the Gods. But it was below the $168.2 million that 2022's Black Adam had earned domestically. Thus, the movie's very low average weekly drop helped the movie's final domestic box office not be as bad as what I had originally projected. And since its primary common element with the only DCEU movie that had an even lower average weekly drop is the character of Aquaman, as played by Jason Momoa, his presence in the movie and the huge box office success of the 2018 Aquaman movie did help Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, but other factors came together that adversely impacted the movie's theatrical run, as demonstrated by its very low opening weekend box office. Now, before the movie had premiered, I had also projected what the movie's final global gross box office revenue might be by relying on the franchise average domestic share of 40.29% and creating a range around it that was one standard deviation above and below, which worked out to be a range from 32.74% to 47.84%. And when I did that, along with my initial projections for the movie's final domestic box office, I got a range of possible final global gross box office values from $143.4 million at the low end, $209.6 million at the mid-range, and $335.1 million at the upper end. And that range ended up being far too low since after the movie's opening weekend, its domestic share was initially only 25.69%, which was quite a bit lower than one standard deviation from the franchise average. So my next set of projections that included the opening weekend box office numbers were higher than this original projection, but after the second weekend, the projections for final global gross box office were considerably higher, from $419.9 million at the low end, $495.7 million at the mid-range, and $616.2 million at the upper end. And the movie's actual final global gross box office earnings of $434 million is within that projected range, but at its low end. And because that projected midpoint value of $495.7 million was still well below the $512.5 million needed by the movie to break even, I fully expected Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom to flop, which it ultimately did, but not by much. Now, the fact that the movie managed to earn over $400 million was the first time that a DCEU movie had reached that level since 2018's Aquaman, whose global box office earnings were just below $1,144 million. And every DCEU movie that had preceded 2018's Aquaman had earned more than $600 million at the global box office. 2019's Shazam only earned $363.6 million globally, but it broke even thanks to it having a very low production budget. 2022's Black Adam nearly broke $400 million, but failed to do so and also failed to break even. So 9 movies after 2018's Aquaman, another DCEU movie finally managed to break $400 million, but wasn't quite enough to break even. The negative factors that prevented Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom from being able to break even included the following. And I think the biggest factor was James Gunn's 2022 announcement that he and Peter Safran were going to reboot the DCEU into the DCU, and that pretty much all of the actors who had taken part in the DCEU would be replaced, including Jason Momoa. So it was quite clear that Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom would be the last Aquaman movie, and that fact alone may have driven a lot of would-be moviegoers away from wanting to watch it. I think it likely that most probably regarded the remaining DCEU movies to be a waste of time, since none of them would continue beyond their final projects. So it wasn't just Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom that was adversely impacted. Shazam! Fury of the Gods was no doubt also adversely impacted, as were The Flash and Blue Beetle, though in the latter's case, lack of familiarity with the Blue Beetle character was a definite detriment to the movie's success. And as for The Flash, Warner Bros. Discovery had spent far too much money producing it, and the troubles that its lead actor Ezra Miller had gotten into throughout 2022 didn't help it either. The second biggest negative factor was undoubtedly the actress Amber Heard, because a lot of people don't like her due to the false allegations that she had made against her ex-husband, Johnny Depp. And many celebrated, including myself, when she lost his defamation lawsuit against her on June 1st, 2022 regarding those allegations, as I had talked about in a video that I had released at the time. Then in March of 2019, a petition was launched on the website change.org demanding that Amber Heard be replaced in Aquaman 2. Naturally, Warner Bros. Completely ignored the petition, but as of the time that I am recording this video, more than 4.6 million people had signed it. That's a lot of people, and if we speculate the possibility that all of the people who signed the petition chose not to see Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, that's a lot of potential money that this movie could have earned. In the US alone, 4.6 million people times an average movie theater ticket price of $10.53 would be a figure of around $48.8 million, which is not enough by itself to push Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom into breaking even, but had more people also not been turned off by James Gunn's decisions, the movie might have been able to break even. But I could cite some additional possible negative factors that may have worked against the movie. First, it was the 4th DC movie released in 2023, and that may have simply been too many for one single year. Second, it had competition like Wonka starring Timothée Chalamet. And finally, similar to the first one, there may have been some overall superhero movie fatigue because there were also 3 live-action MCU movies released in 2023, along with an animated Sony Spider-Man movie. That made Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom the 8th superhero movie to be released in 2023, which was more than any other year that I am aware of. So with an estimated break-even point of $512.5 million and global gross box office revenue of $434 million, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom probably lost around $78.5 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Warner Bros. Discovery and DC Studios lost around $39.2 million. While Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom marks the end of the DCEU, it's not the last DC movie, and we'll have to wait and see whether the movies that James Gunn and Peter Safran are working on end up being any good or not. Thanks for watching today, And a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.